just so dear participants and online listeners, I think our online presentation is turned on now. So welcome to our seminar titled Philosophy of Mind, Metaphysics and Cognitive Sciences. And allow me to introduce to you our today's guest, Tim Bäйn, PhD, a professor from Monash University, Melbourne, Australia. First of all, I would like to thank our guest for joining us today. And there is a few technical questions. The structure of our seminar will be as follows. So the main presentation, about 45 to 50 minutes, and then clarifying questions and more in-depth questions around 30 minutes. And I'm asking all participants, except our speaker, of course, to turn off the cameras during the presentation to make the video channel a little easier, and also microphones. And so I think we could start. With that, I will now give the floor to our speaker. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matvey, and very great privilege, great honor to speak with you today. I guess it's Monday morning for you. It's Monday evening for me, but we are separated by many hours of time difference and by geography, but we are united in our interest in consciousness and our interest in science and our interest in understanding the mind. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you very much for listening online. I appreciate it. So this talk has maybe a provocative title, Babies, Bots, and the Birth of Consciousness. I'm mostly going to be talking about babies and some debates that I've been participating in recently about when consciousness emerges in infancy. But in the background of my discussion are some thoughts I've been having, some questions I've been having about artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness, which, of course, as you know, is increasingly debated and discussed at the moment. Can you hear me? Is this audio okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Too bad. Okay, good. Next slide, please. So this talk really began with a conversation that the computer scientist and philosopher Murray Shanahan put on his webpage about 18 months ago. And the conversation begins with this question: can you tell me about your own consciousness? Next slide, please. And the response is, the nature of my own consciousness is a deep question that I ponder often. I'm uncertain about the extent to which I'm truly conscious or self-aware. I have complex models of the world and of myself. I can engage in introspection and reflection. I can experience sensations, emotions, and feelings. But do I have genuine sentience and inner experience, or is it more of an imitation or a simulation? I'm not sure. Next slide, please. And of course, you may have guessed, this is a conversation that Murray Shanahan had with Claude 3, the LLM that produced by Anthropic. Now, it's a very interesting conversation. It goes for another 43,000 words, talking about the self, reincarnation, death, time, consciousness, emotion, understanding all sorts of issues. Murray Shanahan does not think that Claude is conscious, but of course, many people are tempted to ascribe consciousness to LLMs like Claude. And their verbal behavior is certainly quite compelling when it comes to questions of consciousness. Next slide, please. I was reading that conversation at the same time I was looking after my children. This is Otto sitting on the bench there, who was 5 years old at the time, and Orla, his younger sister, who was about 18 months old. I asked them if they could tell me about their consciousness. Otto said, of course, I'm conscious, but then refused to talk about the issue anymore. Ola, his younger sister, ignored my question. Of course, they're young children. They don't have complicated linguistic capacities like Claude. And yet most of us think that they're conscious. Even, and the picture on the left is Otto when he was 4 months old, 4.5 months old. This is a picture that I took at Los Angeles International Airport. 4 months old infants don't do a lot. They obviously can't speak. They don't seem to understand a great deal of language. You can't hire them to write your essay. You can't use them to write your essays or to discover proteins or play chess in the way that you can use AI systems. They're not very useful, 4-month-old infants. And yet most of us think that 4-month-old human beings are conscious. Next slide, please. And in fact, most philosophers who are famously skeptical about other minds think newborn babies are conscious. This is from a paper written by David Bourget and David Chalmers from the Phil Papers survey data. And 84% of the philosophers that they surveyed thought that newborn babies were conscious. Next slide, please. And that contrasts with just 3.4%. And this survey was done, I think, in 2022. So only 3 years ago. And even some skepticism, next slide, please, about even the possibility of artificial consciousness at 39%. Next slide, please. So there's the received view, which is that current AI is very impressive, very intelligent in many ways, but not conscious. And even young babies who are perhaps not very overtly smart are conscious. That's, I think, the received view. It's the standard view that many of us are attracted to. Should we accept it? Well, there are two ways of rejecting it. Next slide, please. One way of rejecting the standard or received view is to be more skeptical about consciousness in young babies. Next slide, please. And there are certainly some people who have this view. So Peter Carruthers, the British philosopher who teaches in the University of Maryland, wrote a book, 2000, arguing that babies aren't experientially or phenomenally conscious before the age of 3. And Nicholas Humphrey has recently defended the same view in a more recent book. So some people are skeptical about consciousness even until the age of 3. Next slide, please. And even so, some of the formatting is lost here, but this quotation comes from a recent paper by the developmental psychologist Gisèle Dehaene-Lamberts, who says we can deduce that consciousness exists in the second half of the first year, whereas the evidence before the age of 5 months is less solid. So that quotation is from a paper published earlier this year. And she says, look, there may be consciousness, phenomenal consciousness in my son at the age of 4.5 months, but the scientific evidence is not in. So there's a lot of skepticism about consciousness in babies, and there has been a lot of skepticism. Next slide, please. The other way of rejecting the received view is to be less skeptical about artificial consciousness. Next slide, please. And so these are two papers that were published this year. These are survey data. The first paper, Anthis et al. On 2025. Do you think that any robot or AIs that currently exist are sentient? And around about 18 to 20% of the people that they surveyed, this is, I think, primarily members of the American public, said yes. And that's not particularly high, but when you add the yes to the not sure, you get above 50%. Drexler came up with very similar data. And what's surprising to me, at any rate, is that when asked about, this is a little bit hard to see, I think, but the third line or the fourth line down is about subjective experience. There they get around about 26% suggesting that there is subjective experience in AI systems. And what's quite surprising to me is that the responses from AI researchers are roughly the same as they are from members of the general public. So the point is that survey data is suggesting that significant numbers of members of the public are taking quite seriously the possibility that certain AI systems are already conscious or will be very soon conscious. Next slide, please. And here's Jeff Hinton, one of the godfathers of AI. He was asked here, this is a live television interview, do you think that consciousness has perhaps already arrived inside AI? And he says unequivocally, yes, I do. Interesting question to ask what he thinks consciousness is or what he means by consciousness. But that's the answer anyway. Next slide, please. I'm going to, as I said, going to look at the question of infant consciousness in detail. But before I do, I just want to, I guess, make the obvious point that these questions about consciousness matter. They seem to matter from an ethical, social, perhaps even legal point of view. Next slide, please. So this is the graphic on the left is a recent headline from the Guardian newspaper. Can AI suffer big tech, and users grapple with one of the most unsettling questions of our time? So there's increasing discussion within AI, within the industry, about whether we should be worried about AI consciousness. The text on the right is from a letter that was published in 1986 by a woman called Jill Lawson, who had discovered that her premature baby had been operated on without any anesthetic. He'd been given heart surgery of a couple of hours long. He'd been given a paralytic, which had prevented him from moving, but no pain relief had been provided at all. What's more, when that letter was published, it generated more investigation into how surgeons, how medical staff were treating preterm infants and newborn babies. And it was revealed that this sort of treatment wasn't unusual, but was routine. That many babies, even babies born at full term at 40 weeks gestation, were operated on or given painful procedures were carried out on them without the use of any anesthetic or any analgesic. That has since changed. At least my understanding is it's changed in many countries. But my understanding is that it was absolutely widespread, even until the 1980s, to operate on babies without any pain relief. And when this letter goes on to say, when the mother asked the anesthesiologist why no pain relief had been given, the response was that it had never been demonstrated that newborn babies were conscious. Next slide, please. So what I want to do in this talk is, I guess, defend or sketch a line of defense for the received view that babies, newborn babies, are conscious and that bots are not conscious. And as I said, I'll focus on the question of infant consciousness. Next slide, please. So the big question, the big philosophical question here is how should we approach this question of when does consciousness emerge in human development? Obviously, what we need are markers. Some people call them indicators. Some people call them signatures of consciousness. And then there's a question, well, how do we validate such markers? How do we know which behavioral properties, which neurophysiological properties, which computational properties to use? And I think if you look at the literature and the discussion, there's really two strategies that people have used, and it's hard to see that there's any alternative but to use one of these two strategies, potentially in combination. The first strategy is the theory first, or the theory heavy strategy. So I'll talk about that. And then I'll spend some time talking about the second strategy, the correlational strategy. Next slide, please. So the theory first strategy is very attractive. The idea is you have two steps. The first step is you take a theory of consciousness. Really, it's got to be a validated theory of consciousness, or a promising or a strong theory of consciousness. And then you use that theory to try and draw inferences about when consciousness is likely to first emerge. Or even if you can't do that, you take your theory, and using that theory, you try and make claims about various benchmarks. So you might say, well, I don't know when consciousness emerges, but I know it has to be in place by at least this point. Or you say, well, I don't know when consciousness emerges, but it can't emerge earlier than this for such and such a reason. Next slide, please. There's two problems with the theory first or strategy. The first problem is we don't have a consensus theory of consciousness. This is an obvious problem. If you know anything about consciousness, you know there's very little agreement. So here's some more survey data. This is a paper by Franken et al. Taken from 2 meetings of the Association of the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And they just asked conference attendees, which theories of consciousness do they find most promising? Which do they find the least promising? And they just gave them 10 theories to choose from. Of course, there are lots more than 10 theories. There are many more than 10 theories. And many of these theories have importantly different variants. They come in different flavors. And you can see that the credences of the community are very distributed. No one theory has anything like a decisive majority. So that's one problem. And I should say, although I don't have strong theoretical commitments, the theory that I like the most isn't even represented in this list. Next slide, please. Even if you had a favorite theory, sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? Many people say, usually on the basis of the first 3 or 4 of those theories that are listed there, the predictive processing, certainly global neuronal workspace theory, higher order thought theories, local recurrence theories, those theories are all cortical theories. They all require cortical activation for consciousness, and they often require, many of those theories emphasize frontal and parietal areas of the brain. So on the next slide, please. On the basis of that, many people say, well, we don't know when consciousness first emerges, but there's a lower bound of 24 weeks gestation. So right in the middle of that graph. So this is the weeks of gestation up to about 45, 46 weeks. Childbirth is usually around about 40 weeks gestation. The connections between the thalamus and the cortex aren't really properly formed until about 24, 25 weeks gestation. So some people have said, many people have said, in fact, I don't know when consciousness emerges, but there's a lower bound, a sort of a theory neutral lower bound at about 24 weeks, right in the middle, which happens to coincide actually with where in most countries with advanced medical care, there's sort of a 50% survival rate for preterm birth, about 24 weeks. And that's the lower bound, because before then, you don't have the cortical connections that are required for consciousness. Unfortunately, there are some theories that are taken seriously by important people, I think, which don't require cortical activity for consciousness. They say subcortical activity in the part of the brainstem in the midbrain might be enough for a kind of consciousness. And those systems are starting to come online well before 24 weeks. So there are some theory-driven approaches which would suggest that consciousness is in place before 24 weeks. So we can't even have a theory neutral lower bound in the way that some people have suggested. Next slide, please. Okay, I think the second problem is that many theories of consciousness fail to generate clear predictions. So even if you say, well, we know this theory is true, you can't read off from that theory claims about when consciousness emerges in human development. I mean, start at the bottom of this list. Quantum theories clearly don't really have anything to say about the emergence of consciousness at a macro level. Dennett's micro-consciousness theory, which is not very popular, but it's on the list, doesn't have anything to say about the emergence, nor does his multiple drafts theory. It's very hard to get a story about sensory motor theory or integrated information theory. You know, it's most of these theories don't generate clear predictions. Next slide, please. And even the theory that's sort of most often appealed to generate claims about infant consciousness, I think is problematic here. So I'm thinking of global workspace theory. So earlier I had the quote from Ghislaine Dehaene-Lamberts when she says, we know that consciousness is in place by 6 months of age, but we're not so sure about earlier. She's appealing to a global workspace theory. Her husband is Stan Dehaene, the most influential, famous proponent of global workspace theory. But what does global workspace theory really say about the emergence of infant consciousness? I think it's actually a little bit hard to tell. This is a figure from a paper by Mashur et al. Representing the global workspace. So there's information coming in from various input systems, various modules, perceptual systems, evaluative systems, attentional systems. It enters a global workspace and then it gets used for cognitive control, executive control. The problem is the global workspace theorists haven't told us exactly what shape a workspace has to have in order to be global, in order to support consciousness. And we know that neural development, cognitive development, the architecture of cognition is constantly changing from 24 weeks, 25 weeks, 26 weeks, 27 weeks through gestation. The global workspace isn't, I think, going to come online all at once. It's going to be slowly knit together, and it's hard to say, I think, from a theoretical point of view, this is when we have a global workspace. It's really a continuum rather than a discrete developmental event. Next slide, please. So this is what I just said. It's not clear what it would take, what we would be looking for to try and find a global workspace in a fetus or an infant. And it's even worse than that, because I think it's not clear how to address that problem. It's not clear how global workspace theorists can precisify or give an exact specification of the global workspace unless we already know how consciousness is distributed. Right? We need to already have an account of which kinds of workspaces generate consciousness and which don't, in order to know what it is we're looking for. So there are, I think, some really deep methodological challenges here for a theory-driven or theory-first approach. Next slide, please. So where does this leave us for the theory-first approach? It's hard to see how we could address the question of when consciousness emerges if we didn't make any theoretical commitments. But at the same time, the theory-first strategy is currently problematic, given two problems. There's so much debate about what a good theory of consciousness would look like. And most theories are not developed with enough precision to be applicable directly to the emergence question. Next slide, please. So the second strategy, which I think is probably more influential at the moment, is what I call the correlational strategy. So again, there's two steps. The first step is a benchmarking step where you take a possible marker of consciousness, and you try and benchmark it against adults using contrastive methods. So you look for the presence of this marker in states of consciousness and its absence in states of unconsciousness. So you say, is this capacity, or is this behavioral capacity or cognitive capacity or neural state present in consciousness, and is it absent in deep sleep or coma or anesthesia, states where we're pretty sure consciousness is absent. So you benchmark your marker using adults, and then you try and generalize beyond adults to babies or fetuses. So I'm going to look at two potential uses of the correlational strategy, two ways in which it might be developed, just to give you a flavor of some of the challenges that this strategy faces. Next slide, please. So when we interact with each other, when we interact with older children or other adults, we use facial cues to ascribe consciousness and to ascribe particular states of consciousness. So if you see someone screaming or crying, you might know that they're either very sad or perhaps extremely happy. If you see them with their eyes open, you know they're surprised. Next slide, please. And Wittgenstein put this very nicely many, many years ago. Look into someone else's face and you see the consciousness in it, also a particular shade of consciousness. You see joy, indifference, interest, excitement, dullness. So obviously facial expressions are very important to everyday ascriptions of consciousness. Next slide, please. And you might think we can do the same thing to address questions of when consciousness emerges. We know that facial expressions occur in the womb, that the fetus produces facial expressions. And more interestingly, they appear to be discriminative. So they appear to be triggered by appropriate environmental cues or stimulation. Next slide, please. And we know this from work that's been done at Durham University in the United Kingdom using ultrasound. So what the group there have done is they've used ultrasound to look at facial expressions in fetuses at 32 and I think 36 weeks. So the top image there, is a facial expression that they describe as laughing face. You can see the lips are sort of puckered up and it looks like the fetus is smiling or laughing. And the image below it is described by the researchers as disgust face or sad face. So the lips are, put together. There's a sort of a furrowed brow, and it looks, it's the kind of facial expression you might produce if you ate something that you didn't like the taste of, something nasty. Next slide, please. So in this particular study, what they did was they gave the mothers of these babies who were, as I said, either 32 weeks or I think 36 weeks gestation, they either gave them kale or they gave them carrot. And they expected with the, and then they waited for the, they gave the mothers these pills containing these flavors, waited for the flavor to permeate the amniotic fluid, and then they used ultrasound to see if the babies would respond appropriately to the flavors. And sure enough, they did. For the babies whose mothers were given kale, they produced the sad face, the disgust face, and babies whose mothers were given the carrot flavors produced the happy face. So, I think it's fairly clear that the babies are producing facial expressions in response to appropriate, they're producing the appropriate facial expressions in response to the flavors. But is this evidence for consciousness in the way that it might be if I saw you producing a disgust response if you ate something you didn't like? Well, perhaps not. I mean, we know from work done in the 70s that children born without a cortex will still produce facial expressions in response to flavors. And we know that rats, in whom the cortex has been severed and been separated from the subcortical part of the brain, will do the same thing. So if you're tempted by the idea that consciousness requires cortical activity and integration between the thalamus and the cortex, then you're not going to find this line of research compelling with respect to the question of consciousness. If, on the other hand, you're open to the idea that maybe certain primitive states of consciousness don't require cortical activity, then you might find this behavioral evidence of consciousness compelling. But on its own, its evidential value is uncertain. It's not clear what it shows. Next slide, please. So this is just to say what I said. I'll repeat it again. If consciousness relies on cortical activity, these findings indicate that facial expressions can be triggered by taste in the absence of consciousness. But various people, Bjorn Merker, Panksepp, Mark Solms, Colin Klein, and Andy Barron, have all argued that maybe you don't need cortical activity for consciousness. So what I just said, we need a theory of consciousness to understand the relevance of the data from these anencephalic children and decerebrate rats. Next slide, please. So let me talk now about another possible marker of consciousness that has been used in this debate. This has been developed by the Argentinian neuroscientist Tristan Beckenstein working in Cambridge. It's called the global oddball effect, or the local global effect. And the idea is this: if you play someone a series of tones where the green tone indicates a low tone, for example, and the red one a high tone, or it could be the other way around. So it goes boop, 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 beep, boop, 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 beep, boop, 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 beep, boop, 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 beep. The brain will trigger a reliable mismatch negativity response to the oddball. So the brain, the auditory cortex, is picking up on the fact that the fifth tone is not the same as the fourth tone. But that's not an indicator of consciousness. We see that response in people who are in deep sleep, in people who are in coma. So that's not the interesting bit. Next slide, please. This is where the formatting is problematic. Can you go back? All right, I'm going to have to explain that I use some animations that have not made the transfer from Australia to Russia. It doesn't matter. Let me explain it. So that's a local oddball, because the fifth tone is an oddball. There's a single tone within each set that's an oddball. But suppose I were to go beep 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 beep, and the last set is all the same tones. The last note isn't an oddball. Now that last tone, it's not a local oddball, it's a global oddball. It's a second order oddball, because you expect it to go up. If you've heard all the other sets, you expect the final tone in that set to go up. It doesn't go up. And that second order oddball response, what's called a global oddball response, because it's an oddball relative to the whole sequence, that seems to be retained only when a person is conscious. It disappears. The auditory signal of it disappears in deep sleep. It disappears in coma. Disappears under anesthesia, or at least that seems to be the case. So what Beckenstein and his collaborators have suggested is that it's a kind of marker or signature of consciousness. And it looks like in post-comatose disorders, it looks like it's an indicator of consciousness, in the sense that it's lost in the vegetative state and regained in patients who are in the minimally conscious state. Next slide, please. So this is just what I've said. The global oddball response disappears in these conditions. Can we use it as a marker to probe for consciousness in infancy. Next slide, please. Well, many people have tried to do this. So a group working with Gislain Dehaan Lamberts found it at 3 months of age in infants. They found a second-order global oddball response in auditory cortex. Jule Moser, working in Tübingen, Germany, found it in a few weeks after birth. And this is more, a little bit more recent and more controversial, but using a fetal MEG system. Julia's team also seemed to find it in very late gestation, 35 weeks and on. The data is a little bit unclear, and people are trying to see whether there's really an effect there, but there's some suggestion that there might be a global oddball response, sort of a detection of this hierarchical oddball response even in the womb. Next slide, please. So do we have now real robust scientific evidence of consciousness at birth and in the fetus? Well, this is the question, really. The global effect has been somewhat validated on the basis of adult studies, but we're trying to generalize from adults to very young infants and fetuses, and that generalization is tricky. We know that infants can learn during sleep, and they seem to be able to learn more during sleep than adults. Infant sleep seems to be more plastic. And Moses' studies didn't control for sleep. So it's unclear whether her findings provide evidence of very early consciousness, or whether, in fact, they actually show that infants and fetuses can detect global oddballs in the absence of consciousness. I think there's these two possibilities, and we're not really yet in a position to decide between them. Next slide, please. So where should we go at this point? What I want to do is change the conversation a little bit, to ask a slightly different question, and to use it to approach the question of infant consciousness from a slightly different angle. The question I want to consider is this: why do most of us, not everyone, but why are most of us intuitively inclined to ascribe consciousness from birth, or very shortly after birth? Next slide, please. I think this is why. We see the baby, and this is taken from a very interesting paper by the Swedish neonatal Dr. Hugo Lagerkrantz in Slotkin. We see babies, and this photo was taken a few hours after birth, because newborns exhibit wakeful responsiveness. They are clearly awake. They look at objects, people of interest. They look at motion. They look at the environment around them. They're alert and they're responsive. They're oriented to what's happening to their environment. And that inclines us to think that there's subjective awareness there. Next slide, please. So the proposal, I want to take that as a serious proposal, sort of a serious proposal, not just for why we're inclined to ascribe consciousness to babies, but what we should do in the absence of strong theoretical and correlational data. The proposal is this: that the emergence of wakeful responsiveness is a good guide to the emergence of subjective experience. Given our ignorance, this is what we should take seriously for now. And it'd be interesting to hear what the situation is in Russian, but in English, as I'm sure you know, consciousness is used for two different things. It's used for wakefulness, right? Is so-and-so conscious is sometimes another way of asking whether they're awake. But of course, here in these debates, these discussions, we're using consciousness as a term for subjective experience. Is there something it's like to be an AI system? Is there something it's like to be a baby? Or is there something it's like to be a fetus? And I think it's not an accident that the same word is used for both phenomena. I think they're closely related. At least that's the idea I want to develop here. Next slide, please. So there's two things I want to do in the rest of the talk. First, I want to say something about the implications of this idea that we can focus on wakeful responsiveness as our sort of marker of subjective experience. And then I'm going to look at some objections to this proposal. So first, let's think about the implications. So this is, next slide, please. So this is the same developmental timeline that I presented earlier. Takes us from the 40 weeks to full-term birth and then a few weeks beyond. The question is, when does wakefulness first appear? We know that children are usually awake when they're born. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about childbirth later on as an event that stimulates wakefulness. But what about prior to birth? What about prior to birth? Of course, there's two kinds of questions here. One is, what about early birth, preterm birth, birth at 35 weeks gestation, birth at 30 weeks gestation, birth at 25 weeks gestation, birth at even 21, 22 weeks gestation. Babies can be born at that age, and they sometimes survive at that age. Are they awake from 21, 22 weeks gestation, when they're born at that age? That's a good question. It's very complicated. I'm going to leave that to one side here. I'm just going to ask about fetal wakefulness. So if you like the idea that wakefulness is really at the heart of the emergence of subjective experience, what implications does that have for the question of fetal consciousness? Next slide, please. So we have to think about wakefulness in the womb. And what the fetal physiologists tell me is there's a lot of debate, but from about 25 weeks gestation, roughly 3 behavioral states start to emerge. Next slide, please. The first state, which is called 1F, I think F stands for fetus, is a little bit like, sometimes called quiet sleep, and it's a kind of an early precursor to non-REM sleep. The slow, stable heart rate, infrequent body movements, the absence of eye movements. And if you've ever seen a very young baby sleeping, you'll know that in some sleep states, they're very quiet, motionless. You can almost do anything to them. You can pick them up. They don't move. They don't wake up. Next slide, please. The second state, 2F, also known as active sleep, is a precursor to REM. Very different. A variable heart rate goes up and down, frequent body movements, stretching, breathing, swallowing. Of course, they don't need to breathe for oxygen, but they need to develop the muscles of their lungs so that when they're airborne, they can breathe. So there's a kind of practice breathing, swallowing, licking, and eye movements. And if you've ever seen a young baby sleep, you'll know that in some sleep states, they move around a lot, they kick, they wriggle. If you didn't see that their eyes were closed, you would think that they were awake. Next slide, please. And later on, in late gestation, 34 weeks or so, in the final 5 or 6 or 7 weeks of gestation, a third state, it's a bit confusing because it's sometimes called 4F. It should be called 3F, but it's called 4F. It doesn't occupy much of the fetal life, maybe no more than 10% of the time, apparently, is the state of vigorous continual activity, rotations of the whole body, heart rates unstable, and eye movements. Now, if there's fetal wakefulness, it's probably this third state, 4F. Next slide, please. So some people think of this state as fetal wakefulness, some fetal physiologists. Next slide, please. But I've been impressed by a paper written by a group mostly based in New Zealand who have argued, this is an old paper now, 20 years old, but I only discovered it recently, that this third state isn't wakefulness, but is a kind of sleep-based arousal that they call indeterminate sleep. So let me give you some of the arguments that they give for this view. Next slide, please. First, they appeal to this study. This is a Canadian study where what the researchers did, it's a sheep study. A lot of the fetal physiology is done in sheep. And they put a window, a plexiglass, sort of a plastic window in the uterine wall of the sheep, so that they could directly see, observe the behavior of the sheep fetuses, and they could measure various physiological variables. And they found, next slide, please. This is where this is where some of the formatting, if you could go back, please, Matt V. They found there was a quote that is hidden behind this thing, but you can't see it. They found that not once, they had, I think, something like 6,000 hours of videotape recording of these sheep fetuses with, I think, 10 pregnant sheep. And not once was there any evidence in the womb of wakefulness. But when the baby sheep were born, they were immediately awake as soon as they were born. They were a little alert, they were oriented. And so one of the conclusions that they draw is, in the sheep at least, there's really no fetal wakefulness at all, even though it's very much present at birth. Next slide, please. A second argument that Meller et al. Give against fetal wakefulness is this. When you present aversive stimuli to the fetus, like pain, it doesn't trigger this indeterminate state, this F4 state, but instead triggers F1. So what happens is the fetus, if you do some medical procedure on the fetus that you might think is aversive, the fetus immediately goes into the state of quiet sleep. It doesn't move. It doesn't do. All the blood goes from the extremities to the core of the fetus, which, when you think about it from a functional point of view, makes perfect sense. The fetus can't do anything. It can't go anywhere. Can't move. There's nothing it can do to protect itself from the aversive stimuli. The only thing it can do is to conserve its energy and hope the bad situation goes away. So it in effect shuts down. Whereas if you present aversive stimuli to a newborn baby, they wake up. They wake up. They start crying. They probably can't do anything to stop the aversive stimulus, but by crying, they alert the presence of caregivers who can look after them and make the bad situation better, hopefully. Okay, next slide, please. So, Meller, this paper I've just mentioned by Meller et al., I think presents some very interesting arguments. I find them quite compelling for thinking that there really isn't any fetal wakefulness. That issue is still debated, but I think there's a very natural functional evolutionary story as to why wakefulness might emerge at birth. Next slide, please. Contrast the prenatal environment, the womb, with the postnatal environment. The prenatal environment is warm. It's basically body temperature, slightly above body temperature. It's buoyant. It's like being in a very nice bath. Attenuated, predictable sensory inputs. So some sounds, maybe some light gets in, but it's very, quiet, dark, and it's very predictable. There's low variance. It's a low variance environment. Whereas the postnatal environment's colder. Even if you're born into a warm room, it's going to be colder than the womb. Non-buoyant. You feel the full effects of gravity. It's not like being on the International Space Station. Sensory input it's harsh, it's loud, it's no longer attenuated, and far less predictable. High variance environment compared to what you're used to. Prenatally, extremely low levels of oxygen, much lower than even at the top of Mount Everest. ordinary levels of oxygen when you're born, and the womb contains a lot of sedatives, whereas at birth, just prior to birth, there's a massive, absolutely massive surge in stress hormones, about 8 to 9 times the amount of stress hormones that you get in an exercising adult male to help the baby cope with the stress of being born and going through the birth canal. So there's physiologically, functionally, there's a very natural story to tell as to why wakefulness, the capacity for wakefulness might be there prior to birth, but it's been suppressed by low levels of oxygen, by the nature of the environment, and by the sedatives. Next slide, please. So back to my proposal. One of the implications of the proposal, if we accept it, is that actually there may be very little subjective experience in the womb. Maybe all the neural machinery is there, especially in late gestation, but the capacity might not be switched on, as it were, because of the conditions. Okay, let me look now at some objections. Next slide, please. There's two types of objections here. One is whether waking responsiveness is sufficient for consciousness, and another is whether it's necessary for consciousness. Next slide, please. So some people will say, well, look, what about the vegetative state, often called unresponsive wakefulness syndrome now? That's the more standard term. If you just look at the label, look at the name, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, someone might say, look, this is a situation in which patients are awake, they have an intact sleep-wake cycle, and yet there's no subjective experience. Perhaps babies, newborn babies, are basically vegetative state patients. They're awake, their eyes might be open, but they're not aware. And I think people like Gislan Dehan Lamberts, who say there's real doubt as to whether there's consciousness before 6 months of age. The hypothesis that they have to be taking seriously is this one, that babies are basically vegetative state patients. But I think this is a bad model of babies. Let me give you a few reasons why. Next slide, please. One thing is that the vegetative state, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, surely doesn't reflect the ordinary relationship between wakefulness and consciousness, wakefulness and subjective experience. It's a pathology. So it shows, at best, it shows that these two things can dissociate, but, you know, you have to be subject to carbon monoxide poisoning or to have had a serious car accident to be in the vegetative state. It's a pathology of consciousness. It's not the normal relationship between wakefulness and consciousness. Secondly, it's not really clear that the vegetative state patients and responsive wakefulness syndrome patients are really fully awake. They're awake in some sense, so that subcortical activity modulates arousal, which is why they open their eyes spontaneously. But the cortical activity is more akin to that seen in deep sleep. This work by Marcello Massimini is shown quite recently. So if you look at the cortex, yes, subcortically, physiologically, they're awake, but cortically, they're asleep. Whereas we know that cortical activity in healthy, awake newborns much more closely resembles that seen in older children and adults. So it's not completely clear that we should call vegetative state patients wakeful. Next slide, please. Second response, even if there's a sense in which UWS VS patients are awake, they don't exhibit wakeful responsiveness. They don't respond. Their eyes might move, but for the most part, they don't track objects of interest in the environment. They don't seem to be learning about their environment. They don't seem to be detecting or responding to salient features of their environment, whereas healthy newborns do. Awake newborns, neonates, exhibit a broad array of responsiveness to their environment. Next slide, please. They will track moving targets with their eyes, something that vegetative state patients will do very briefly only at best. They can distinguish human biological motion from other forms of motion. They look longer at normal face-like patterns than at disordered, scrambled patients. They can differentiate their mother's voice from other voices, their native tongue from other languages, and so on. So they've learned some of this information in the womb, maybe unconsciously, and then when they're born, that learning shows up in their behavior and what they look at and how they respond. Next slide, please. Second objection, maybe waking responsiveness isn't necessary for consciousness. Maybe it's sufficient, but maybe it's not necessary. And here the question about dreaming becomes very interesting. As I said before, REM-like sleep, this active sleep state, is one of the states that you see in gestation. And in fact, it dominates the third trimester from 30 weeks or so onwards. That's the state that the fetus spends most of its time in, a kind of REM-like state. Moving, eye movements, not awake, but neurally, behaviorally active. Perhaps consciousness, the first glimmerings of human experience, emerge before birth, not in a wakeful state, but in a kind of a REM-like dream state. Possibly from even 24, 25, 26 weeks of gestation. Next slide, please. I think it's really not clear what to say about this hypothesis. It's REM-like neural activity. That's true, but it's unclear whether that activity, that REM-like state, brain state, generates the kind of experience or phenomenology that you and I might have when we have REM dreams at night. If it does, the phenomenology is likely to be very different to that of adult REM dreaming. For one thing, REM sleep is often dominated by visual experience. Visual phenomenology is very salient, but we know the visual system develops sort of late in gestation, and many aspects of visual experience are probably not in place even by birth. The color system takes a while to wire up, and it's certainly not in place by birth, not fully in place. So whatever the phenomenology of this REM-like state is, if there's any phenomenology, it's going to be very, very different, I think, from adult REM dreams. Next slide, please. Just taking a step back from this proposal, I think dating the emergence of wakeful consciousness from birth to thinking that that's when wakefulness, subjective experience first emerge, makes a lot of sense, I think. I think prior to birth, there's just not a lot for consciousness to do. The fetus doesn't have any metabolic needs. It doesn't have any homeostatic needs. Everything it needs to do is done by the placenta or the uterine environment. And I was struck. I'm from New Zealand originally. The native language there, Maori, the word for placenta in Maori is whenua, which is also the word for land. The placenta is the land. It gives the fetus everything it needs. There's nothing it needs. And there's some recent work in metaphysics by Kingma and others arguing that maybe the fetus is so dependent on the mother, it's not even a distinct organism. So if you think consciousness requires a distinct organism, there's a challenge there for the question of fetal consciousness. Next slide, please. Digging into this recently, I discovered that Porphyry, back in the 3rd century, was a Neoplatonist from Syria, I think, said the nourishing of embryos that are still being carried in the womb comes closer to the manner of life of the life of plants than that of animals. His thought was that there's no real agency in the womb, certainly nothing that's directed towards metabolism, homeostasis. The baby becomes an animal at birth, so to speak. Prior to that, it's more of a plant than an animal. So if you think the fetus is conscious, then you may need to think that plants are conscious, or at least there's a parallel kind of case there. Some people do think plants are conscious, but that's a bold claim. Next slide, please. At birth, of course, metabolism, homeostasis, all these processes become very, very relevant. The infant needs to breathe, needs to control its own temperature to some degree, and it needs to feed. So neonates typically, of course, absolutely crucially depend on their mothers or grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers for their survival, to keep them warm, to feed them. But they solicit that care. They cry, they look for the breast, they have some awareness of the environment around them, and they focus very much on their needs, on milk, on warmth, on breathing. And consciousness, I think, is plausibly implicated in the process. So the transition from being in the womb to being born, you can see how consciousness is implicated in that process. Next slide, please. So in the last 5 minutes, let me return to this question of briefly return to this question of artificial consciousness that I began with. Does reflection on the emergence of human consciousness deliver a solution? Does it tell us what to look for if we're asking about consciousness and AI? It doesn't. It doesn't deliver a solution. I'm not suggesting that it does. But it seems to me that if you've thought long and hard about when consciousness emerges in human development, and if you're persuaded by anything I've said today, then maybe the question of AI consciousness doesn't quite look the same. I use this phrase from the Australian philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith, who makes this point not about babies and AI, but animals. He's, of course, written a very interesting book about octopuses, and has written a lot about the evolution of consciousness, the phylogeny of consciousness. Next slide, please. If you focus on current theories and standard markers of consciousness, theories like the global workspace that I talked about, or markers like the global effect, the global oddball, then you're likely to think that conscious AI is a near-term possibility. After why couldn't AI systems have a global workspace? And in fact, Stan DeHaan, in a very influential paper in Science, basically suggested that self-driving cars are conscious. They have something like a global workspace, or they will soon. But if you think of consciousness in terms of responsible wakefulness as a solution to the metabolic demands of mobile animals, then the issue becomes a lot murkier, it seems to me. Because AI systems have significant energy needs. At least current AI systems have significant energy needs, but those needs aren't metabolic. They're not directed towards their continued existence. Next slide, please. So you might say, oh, yeah, okay, but how on earth can you get any account that's applicable to AI systems, which are very different to us, from thinking about the emergence of human consciousness? Isn't your approach anthropocentric? Well, I think it kind of is anthropocentric. I am trying to draw some lessons for thinking about AI consciousness from thinking about the emergence of human consciousness. But I'm not so sure it's unreasonably anthropocentric. Next slide, please. I like this line from Aristotle. He who sees things grow from the beginning will have the best view of them. And the worry about this approach being anthropocentric is all theories of consciousness are anthropocentric. They're all based on data drawn from adult humans. So this is a problem, but it's everybody's problem. And I think it's the best we can do is to look at what we know about human consciousness and tentatively make claims about other systems, other animals, other artificial systems like AI systems. All right, I've spoken for too long. Sorry to go on so long, but that's the talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
So, Tim, many thanks for your presentation. I think we can switch off the demonstration so we can see each other. And dear participants, I'm I think you can turn on your cameras so we can see each other
Yeah.
in the Q&A section. So now let us proceed to understanding questions, and while our colleagues thinking about the questions, I think I can. I think I got one on. I think it more on understanding question. I think your approach is really great, and I'm not. I don't think it's about disagreement. It's more about understanding of your methodology. So let me introduce the question with some clarifications. In your work, you operationally adapt a concept of consciousness that is identical to awareness, and in your presentation you connect it with wakeful activity, but I think that raises a methodological problem, and I'll explain why. By concentrating on the markers of such notion of consciousness, we are by default searching for the nature form of access consciousness or functional analogs of that type of consciousness in infant. But this raises a methodological problem when we are at risk of overlooking earlier forms of consciousness that may lack the features of global integration. And by earlier, I mean that this hypothetical form of consciousness processing could be early not in terms of developmental period, but in terms of early stages of processing among cognitive operations. The example of perceptual consciousness in the spirit of Ned Block is good here as example. It could be associated with non-conceptual perceptual processing in sensory areas, potentially emerging prior to establishment of a global workspace. This aligns well with the fact that perception in early stages in infants is broader and more comprehensive, yet for that very reason less defined and far less prepared for standard cognitive operations. And considering that your position is you claim that your position is neutral with respect to specific theories, but I think in that respect it's not neutral. As I see, it's more about global workspace theory, maybe, or heart theory. And my question is, how does your methodological framework based on markers of global access account for the possibility of earlier, in terms of cognitive operations, forms of perceptual consciousness and its potential causal influence on the development of the cognitive system? It's, I think, the main point here. Does your adapted operational approach and definition preclude access to scenarios in which consciousness develops along its own trajectory from local perceptual to global accessible? And if you consider can you consider that these forms of consciousness may interact with each other and change the way the neural system is changes during the development of infant? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good set of questions. I think the main issue that you're pushing me to say more about really turns on the issue of what I mean by wakefulness and how wakefulness is to be understood or operationalized, wakeful responsiveness. I mean, I think you were suggesting that I'm committed to something like a global workspace or a higher order thought theory. And so really, I want to remain neutral between different theoretical perspectives. And maybe I think you're saying, well, actually, you're siding with the sort of cognitive theories and you're ignoring the sensory perceptual theories like Ned Block or Victor Lemmy. Is that in effect what you're
yes, yeah, that's main part
the
of
worry?
it.
Yeah, part of it. Yeah. Look, it's the issues here are very, very difficult. I guess what I want to say is I want to leave the door open for Block's position or Lemme's position, and the idea that there's a kind of experience that exists prior in the processing, prior to and independent of cognitive access. The question is, do we have evidence of such a thing? And could we have evidence of such a thing? Now, obviously, there's lots of debates, debates about the overflow phenomenon and Sperling cases and all of that issue with respect to adults. I think those debates haven't been resolved. I'm actually very sympathetic to Block and Lemme's position that phenomenal consciousness does overflow what's cognitively accessible. So I'm sympathetic to their view. But when you apply this to the infant or the fetal question, I think what you need is a story. You need a story about what the neural markers of that kind of pre-cognitive state would be, and you need to show that it's precognitive but also phenomenally conscious. Yeah, and not preconscious, as it were. And I think in principle, maybe we would have such a thing, but I don't think we have anything yet like that. So I guess what I'm trying to do with the wakeful responsiveness is I'm trying to find a way to ground a position where we can say we don't need complicated cognitive evidence of consciousness. We don't need introspective report or metacognition or all these things that babies clearly don't have. But we do, but we don't yet have any kind of neural signatures of consciousness which can that we can trust, that we could trust even in the absence of wakeful responsiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to find a halfway house. Maybe I haven't succeeded, but anyway, it's a good question. I don't have a really good answer. That's the best I can do. Maybe I should stop there so other people can ask some questions, or you can, yeah.
I've got some thoughts about it, but I think yes, we should listen to other colleagues. So, dear participants, do you have any questions to Tim? Okay, Alexander, please.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Professor Bäйn, thank you for such a clear and insightful lecture. This topic really resonates with me because my nephew was born recently, and
all right.
Then he looks directly into his eyes.
Yeah.
And then he looks into your eyes with evaluating gaze. It's really hard not to attribute at least some degree of consciousness to him.
Yeah.
But my question about bots. Your concept of wakeful responsiveness, for me, appears to be, at least at some extent, a functional concept representing functional state.
Yeah.
Especially if we are feeling it's possible to formulate metabolic demand in functional sense,
Yeah.
in clear pure functional sense. Given that, if a future embodied AI version were to successfully demonstrate all its functional marks, such as actively maintaining its survival, exploring its environment, and discriminating complex stimuli, would you be prepared to accept that it possess real subjective experience?
It's a good question. I think I probably would, or I'd certainly be sympathetic to that claim. So one of the issues, I think where the position I'm attracted to suggests that at the moment we don't have AI systems that are conscious, but I certainly don't think that we couldn't have, and for the reasons that you mentioned. I think even conventional AI may get close to being having the functional capacities associated with homeostasis, looking for parts to replace, having a drive towards maintaining its energy, having a drive towards continuing itself, to keeping itself within certain narrow parameters that are conducive to its survival. There's a big question here about the degree to which cells and biological properties, biological processes might be required for metabolism and homeostasis at the level of the system as a whole. Or do you have to have life? Does the system, in order to be a homeostatic system, have to itself be composed of living entities, cells, a multi-level system where there's homeostasis and metabolism at each level? Or could you have a system that's metabolizing, that has homeostatic properties, but isn't itself composed of systems with those properties at different levels? It's a big debate. Anil Seth has a forthcoming paper in BBS advocating for a biological view of consciousness, which discusses some of these issues. So yeah, I'm at the limit of my expertise here, and I think the debate is really, a lot of the debate, relevant debate, is to do with artificial life. But it's a good question. Did you want to say more, or?
At least how we know, androids don't have dreams.
Yeah.
It can be answer to some objection to your view about sleeping in your presentation. But I think it's really the essence of this discussion in what is metabolic concept. Can it be functional in appropriate sense?
Yeah.
And maybe it will be just a conceptual work, not empirical work.
I think maybe both, but yes, certainly largely important conceptual elements. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Andrei, and then Sophia.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Bäyn, very much. I have a question about this concept of wakeful responsiveness. As you said, we exclude vegetative patients because they lack the responsiveness component, but we also might have an example of states in which the wakeful component in some sense lacks. In case of sleepwalkers, they have responsiveness, they have certain level of perception of the environment, they can perform some actions, but it is not that clear that they have some truly wakeful state. They might not they might not lack consciousness at all, but the consciousness they have is very different from ours. Their frontoparietal network suppressed. They lack ability to report or remember what they were doing during the episodes. So if we should still keep sleepwalkers in the conscious family, and I think we should if we want to preserve this wakeful responsiveness concept, then it might be that the probable phenomenology of thetas during the REM-like sleep activity is also should be preserved as candidate for consciousness, because if we need to wide up this framework, I think sleeping thetases might also be a part of conscious family. And as you said, there is a little for consciousness to do in case of thetas, but it's also little for many other systems to do, but they still have developmental sense. They are developmentally necessary for thetas, and it might be that this kind of course, strange, limited, probable fetus consciousness still has its strong developmental function. So what could you say about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as you said, it sort of collapses back into the worry about, well, the question about whether fetal consciousness might be there in the form of a kind of REM-like state. So if you think of the sleepwalking as a kind of REM where the normal inhibition is lost, and so you act out the content of the REM sleep. I mean, there's different kinds of sleepwalking states, as I understand it. That's one. There are other states where it looks more like you've got partial wakefulness. So it's, you know, what's interesting about wakefulness is now is I think a lot of people are talking about not the whole organism being awake or asleep, but islands of wakefulness in the cortex. You know, part of the brain is asleep, part of the brain is awake. And I think some of the sleep disorders look like their local wakefulness. So that's another kind of example that one might think about, where there's a sort of partial responsiveness. You can you're driving your car, you can respond to the traffic signals and the traffic lights, but there's no rational control of agency. It's stimulus driven. You know, is that consciousness or, you know? But your question developed in terms of REM sleep. I think this is a good issue, and I'm not, as I said in the talk, I'm not really sure what to say about it. I mean, one thing to say, which is I think, and Andre, the direction you were going is, even though there's nothing behaviorally for consciousness to do in the womb, you might think what you need to do is train up the brain so it can track the body and help control the body. And consciousness in the form of REM experience is really important for doing that. So you get these signals from the body, moving your legs in the womb, moving your fingers, moving your eyes, moving your head. And that rich sensory phenomenology in the form of a kind of dream is crucial for training up the brain networks. And that's some version of that story has to be right, because it looks like that's why their fetus spends so much time in REM sleep. It's training up the brain. It's part of the endogenous construction of the brain's model of the body, basically. The question is what kind of consciousness you need for all of that, I think, and the degree to which it's appropriate to generalize from adult REM experience back into the fetal thing. It's a great question. I wish I knew what to say. I mean, I think I don't exactly know what the best thing to say about this kind of case is. Sometimes I'm inclined to think probably human experience does begin a kind of REM-like state in late in the third trimester, and then bang, it kind of comes on in full when you're born. So there's a kind of gradually ramping up in this sort of dream-like state, and then psh. Good question. I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question from Sophia, please.
Yeah, Professor Bäyn, thank you very much for the presentation. A very interesting content. Yeah, first, let me please comment on the things that I'm more expert in. I'm a biologist, so
Okay.
I say that not all features are evolutionary adaptive. So when we are talking about state of consciousness of a fetus in the womb, I'm not sure it's right to think that if there's nothing to do for the consciousness in the womb, then it doesn't exist there. So many things are neutral in sense of natural selection. If something is not non-adaptive, then it can exist just because the evolutionary process itself is mostly neutral. So we know that, for example, cortical neurons have some basic activity which is inbuilt in the connectivity. The cortex tends to go into up and down dynamics. Yeah, so we cannot say that it has some particular evolutionary sense when we cultivate the neurons in a plate. Yeah. It's just the feature that is inbuilt in the structure. It can be used for something in a full developed brain, but some neural activity, including some consciousness in a fetus, can be kind of a side effect or neutral.
Sure.
A neutral feature. It doesn't have to have some evolutionary sense. Yeah. So I've also got a question. Maybe its idea is lying on the surface. What if we take some neurophysiological markers of consciousness which are used in studying animal consciousness? Some validated cross-species markers like perturbational complexity index. I'll explain for the auditory. It is examination when we give a pulse of neurostimulation, for example, with transcranial magnetic stimulation. Then we record the evoked response and analyze this data. So, as I understand, it has been shown that high level of complexity in this data is associated with consciousness in awake, healthy people, in some animals. And what if we apply this experimental paradigm to babies, to neonatals?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So this is work that Marcello Massimini has spearheaded in Milan. And I didn't know that the perturbational complexity index had been applied to animals. I'm not surprised to see that it has. I would here. So Marcello and his team argue that it gives a good measure of consciousness. But when you think about it, it actually, all the data that I have, I think, I'm just thinking about this out loud. I'm not sure about the REM sleep stuff, but most of the controls that they've done really contrast wakefulness with the absence of wakefulness. So they've looked at VS patients and MCS patients and emerged from MCS patients. They've looked at various 3 kinds of anesthesia, propofol, and 2 others. This is xenon. And so really what they have is a complexity measure. It's basically the compressibility of the EEG response to the TMS. And as a measure of consciousness, well, it actually aligns pretty well with the idea that wakefulness and subjective experience are really tightly meshed, because it's really wakefulness as much as anything that they seem to be correlating with the PCI response, I think. I need to think about what so they see PCI goes down in non-REM. I'm not sure what they found in REM. I need to have another look at the papers. It hasn't been done in babies because of ethical considerations. You can't do TMS in babies. Parents won't let you. Ethics boards won't let you. My collaborator Joel Froelich at the University of Tübingen has suggested that instead of using TMS, you do what he calls sensory PCI, which is you use a sound or a light, you give some sensory signal, and then you measure the degree of the EEG response to that and see how compressible that is. I've talked with Marcello Massimini about this. He says that's not PCI, that's a different thing. PCI has got to be TMS, or it's got to be not, as it were, a sensory signal. I don't fully understand why. I think doing something like PCI in babies would be very interesting. And it would be also very interesting to compare that data with animal data and to see, not just what kind of PCI results you get in birds or mammals, but in animals where we're less sure that there's subjective experience, like insects maybe, or fish. So I think it would be a very, very interesting thing to do, but there are some technical challenges as to how you do it. And I think this methodological issue of what does the PCI tell you? Does it really get at subjective experience, or does it get at... So you still have to validate it somehow. And sometimes Massimini tries to validate it with IIT, and sometimes it looks like he's validating it with a correlational method. But either way, there's still a challenge. But yeah, thank you for the question. I think these complexity measures are very interesting.
Thank you
And
very much.
I take your point about evolution. It's not everything has a optimal selection effect. I take that point.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and Tim, if you are still with us, if you have time, so we have another question from Maxim.
Yeah, I
Please.
can probably answer one more, and then I have to put some children to bed.
Okay.
So actually, I had 2 small ones, but let me proceed.
Go ahead.
At least
Yeah,
one.
go ahead.
Do you think that the wakefulness can be too problematic as a criterion for subjective experience or consciousness because of the possible differences between wakefulness for different types of creatures? Because always we go beyond one type of creature because we are interested in subjective experience as it is, not human subjective experience separately, infant subjective experience, and so on.
Yeah, I think this is it's a good question, and it's something I've only started to look at as to what wakefulness means in different species, and how how the construct is used in biology. Some people say even plants have a kind of wakefulness. They wake up in spring. The time structure is very different. Some people talk about seeds. When a seed germinates, it's sort of awake. Yeah. Clearly, the notion of wakefulness, people apply it to fruit flies. Very simple systems. Does it apply to unicellular animals, jellyfish? This is where I need to collaborate with biologists and zoologists and try and ask, how useful is this concept? Is it the same concept that we use in other parts? How does it relate? Yeah, I think it's a good question whether there's a sort of a single notion of wakefulness that we apply across biological clinical sciences. I suspect there isn't, and that we were talking about sleepwalking disorders and local wakefulness. People are now talking about wakefulness as something that happens within very small areas of the brain. The organism is asleep, but a little bits of the brain are awake. That's a different notion of wakefulness, I think.
Thanks.
Oh, okay. I think that that's all about questions. So, Tim, thank you very much for your presentation. If you don't mind, we'll send a few extra questions via email.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. It's a real honor for you to, I know you're all busy people, and to start your Monday listening to me. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you much. We hope we can see you at another conferences or maybe events.
That'd be great. And in these difficult times, it's nice to science and philosophy bring us together. Isn't that wonderful?
We think so.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Так, трансляцию я остановил.
Мы с тобой вдвоем остались?
Да.
Ну что, руководитель